2021 monthly meeting. We're glad you have joined us for a presentation on a very important topic that is of great concern in our society today, the opioid crisis. We look forward to hearing from presenter David Teeter very shortly. It is certainly hard to believe that it has been 1 year since we have been able to meet in person. On March 3, 2020, we had our last monthly meeting together at the Holland Civic Center. Our guest for the program was Lindsay Olson, daughter of House member Annette Daly, who presented a presentation that was titled The Art of Sound in the Sea. As we all know, in mid-March, our world and our lives changed. During this last year, we have lived through the pandemic, not knowing what lay ahead. I have often heard people use the phrase, or a variation of it, "We now see the light at the end of the tunnel." Each time I heard this phrase, my memory took me back to the many times that I traveled on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and especially to my first trip back in 1957, when I traveled from my home in New Jersey out here to Holland, Michigan, to begin my freshman year at Hope College. At that time, the Turnpike was quite new, but it was completed from the Delaware River to the Pennsylvania-Ohio border. Also at that time, there were 7 tunnels that cut through the many mountain ranges along the way. The tunnels were different in mileage lengths, and the spaces between them were also different. Unless you were really paying attention, it was easy to lose track of which tunnel you were in and how many more tunnels were still ahead. It was always a relief to see that little slit of light that finally appeared in the distance at the end of the tunnel. And of course, as we moved forward and made progress, it grew bigger and brighter. I also remember that there was a sign near the entrance of each tunnel, and it had 3 instructions. 1, remove sunglasses. 2, turn on your headlights. And finally, stay in your lane. I will let you put your own spin on these instructions and this little reflection of mine. But to me, both have been helpful as I look back over this past year and see the progress that we have made and will continue to make as we hopefully move through the last tunnel. We will reach our destination. We will get there, and we will get there together. I had hoped to have a report to you from the COVID-19 committee, but we are meeting next week. And at that time, Scott Travis from the college will be meeting with us and will give us an up-to-date report on current circumstances and status of protocols at the college. We hope that he will be able to give us some information which will help as we plan for the summer and fall terms. We will send relevant information to you as we stay informed and make safe decisions as we move into the next few months of planning for the future. It is encouraging to know that so many of us have been able to be vaccinated and that there seems to be an increased availability of the vaccine and places to receive it. Looking ahead over the winter-spring term calendar, it looks as though our midterm week is coming up very, very soon. But there are still many great classes that you can attend during this term and I would urge you to take another look at the courses that are scheduled for March and April. Courses coming up that relate to the term focus of diversity, equity, and inclusion are nonfiction book discussion on Caste by Isabel Wilkinson, reading Moby Dick in 2021, how Holland Public School is bringing educational inequities how Holland Public Schools is bridging educational inequities caused by COVID-19. Nonviolent socio-political action, and white walling, art, race, and protests in 3 acts. We hope that you will take advantage of the opportunity to register and attend additional classes during the coming weeks. Thank you to all of our HASC members who have gotten their COVID-19 vaccines and are now helping low-income clients at Community Action House to prepare and file their income taxes. Maura Reynolds has also informed me that recently she has received several requests for volunteers that have come to her attention. Please watch for constant contacts and the next monthly newsletter to learn more about these new opportunities, which will include volunteering with Hope classes at Windmill Island and at the Holland Museum. And special events will be hosting more trivia game nights during the next couple of months. The previous trivia nights have been very successful, and if you haven't had a chance to join in the fun, try to attend one of the game nights this spring. More information about these events will be coming your way by our constant contacts. And now Carla Verskure, Chairperson of Membership, will introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Barb. Good morning, HASC members. I'm glad so many could join us on this, even though chilly but yet sunny day, a sign that spring is coming. We do not have any new members to introduce today, but we do have a guest, and I'd like to introduce Linda Simon and give her a HASC welcome. Linda, we're so glad you could join us this morning. And thank you all for welcoming her in our remote way.
Thank you, Carla, and welcome, Linda. Joyce Mott, member of our monthly program committee, will now introduce today's program and presenter.
David Teeter, our speaker for today, was Senior Director of Transportation Initiatives at the National Safety Council and founded Focus Driven LLC, dedicated to reducing motor vehicle crashes resulting from driver distraction. He has served as CEO of several companies, and in 2017 became Executive Director of Oregon Addictions Recovery, OAR. OAR is a residential and outpatient center providing treatment and the hope of recovery for individuals and families struggling with alcoholism and chemical dependency. OAR provides personalized treatment, group, and one-on-one support and education for individuals, families, and communities in Ottawa and Allegan counties. We are privileged to have David Teeter give us insight and better understanding of the disease of addiction and life in recovery. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Joyce. I'm excited to be with you this morning. I really hate doing this on Zoom. I'm sure most of you would prefer to meet in person as well. But unfortunately, I do have a little experience. I know, I was saying earlier, I know way more about Zoom than I ever hoped or thought I would. It's been quite a year, and we've learned to meet this way. And certainly it's better than the alternative would have been if we were going through this 10 or 20 years ago without the technology that's available today. Just a little bit more of my background as it relates to hope. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Both my parents were involved with the Ohio State University, and I had no interest in going to such a big university. I had a friend in high school who was a member of the only Christian Reformed church in the city of Columbus, and there wasn't a Reformed church back then, and he could go to college anywhere he wanted, but the only places folks would pay for was Calvin. So he was going to Calvin, and there were three of us who were friends of his who we all kind of wanted to go to school together, but two of us played football, and Calvin didn't have a football team. So long story, two of them were at Calvin, two of us ended up at Hope. I came up here in 1973 to go to Hope College, knowing very little about it. My parents, through their academic connections, saw that Hope had a good reputation. And back then, it was, may still be, but it was a very reasonable price for a Division III school. I think it was cheaper than any of the Division III schools I'd looked at in Ohio. So I came to Hope and had 4 wonderful years there. I expected to not probably stay in West Michigan to go on to graduate school, but one thing led to another. I got a nice job offer my senior year, and I think I was looking through the people that are on the Zoom meeting. I saw the last name Rediker, and if that's Jerry and Elsie Rediker, Jerry offered me a job my senior year in 1973 at People's State Bank in downtown Holland, and I met a Holland girl. We got married. We've been married 42 years now, and I've never left West Michigan. I'm still here. It's been a wonderful life, and I owe that all, quite frankly, to the start I got at Hope College. So with that background, let me talk to you a little bit about what we're gonna talk about today. I've titled this "The Way Out." For some of you who may know, Alcoholics Anonymous has been around since the 1930s. It's helped millions and millions of people address their addiction and lead a life of recovery. In the early days, they were trying to decide what to name their book and their movement, and they all decided they would call themselves The Way Out because it offered a way out of addiction and a terrible life into a life of renewal. However, there were some copyright issues with that. There were several other books or organizations, so they settled on their second choice, which was Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, that's gone on to spur all kinds of anonymous type groups for people struggling with all kinds of addictions, both chemical and behavioral. Today, we're going to talk about 3 things. We're going to talk about the disease of addiction. We're going to talk about the impact it has on families and society, and then we're going to talk about recovery and what that means. So let's start with the disease of addiction. Now, some of you probably understand, and maybe some of you are even of this mindset, but for many, many decades, addiction was looked at as a moral failure. It was the result of bad choices that people made. It was in 1955, which was actually the year I was born, that the American Medical Association first classified it as a disease based on, criteria for disease classification at the time. Let me give you there's all kinds of definitions of addiction. I've got a couple here I want to share with you that I think are very good. Addiction's a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. And then the second one I like a lot, people with addiction, they use substances or they engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. That's from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and I like that. So addiction is like lots of other diseases. And let me just give you a few to compare it to. There is a lifestyle component to addiction. There are choices made generally early on, although as the addict progresses in their disease, that ability to choose tends to leave. But there are choices made, but there's also choices made with diseases like diabetes or high blood pressure or obesity, sometimes even cancer like smoking and so forth. So, all diseases are not free of lifestyle decisions and choices. They're involved in many, many. Those lifestyle changes or choices start interacting with genetics. We know that addiction it can almost always be traced back in families and the environment, and that all has an impact on the eventual outcome for an addict. Changing lifestyle choices and behaviors can stabilize and improve functioning, just like it does for a diabetic or someone with high blood pressure, or somebody who's overweight. So, certainly lifestyle choices need to be addressed. Behaviors and choices that started a person on the path to addiction or any other disease, but once the person has the disease, we need to treat it as an illness. And that's been going on in certainly in our country for a couple of decades now. At least we've looked at it that way. I think because, and we'll talk more about the opioid epidemic in a little bit, but I think because of that and the numbers of people, that the raw numbers of people that's touched in our country, more and more people now understand the concept of addiction as a disease, as a brain disease. Unfortunately, addiction involves, in most cases, maybe not all, but in many cases, relapses, or what they used to call in Alcoholics Anonymous in the early days, slips. But if you think about it, so do other diseases. Whether somebody's overweight and works hard to change their lifestyle and how they eat, they have relapses. That changes on and off. People, don't always manage their diabetes the way they should because of lifestyle decisions. So when that happens, we don't stop treating them. We don't punish them. We understand that that's part of the disease, and we continue to treat it. I mentioned that addiction is a brain disease. It all has to do with how our brain processes dopamine. And I'm guessing most of you, dopamine and serotonin are two of the pleasure drugs that are kind of produced internally by our brains. They reward good behavior. They reinforce behavior that is beneficial to the individual. I saw a presentation by one of the leading addiction neuroscientists in the country who started the show with a slide that said the human being needs three things, and they need all three to survive. They need food, they need water, and they need dopamine. Now that's a little bit of an exaggeration. We need oxygen, we need a few other things, but his point was that a human being cannot survive any more without dopamine than they can eventually without food or water. And dopamine is literally what gets us out of bed in the morning. Dopamine is what causes us to take sustenance, to eat. It causes us to procreate. I mean, it reinforces all of the positive behaviors in our life that are necessary for our survival. And what happens to the brain of an addict is their ability for those dopamine receptors to function normally is severely impacted. And it varies depending on the drug of choice and how much they use and how long they've been an addict. But we'll talk more about it in a minute. Opioid addicts, heroin addicts, prescription drug addicts, there's some consideration and belief now that ability for dopamine to function normally may be gone forever. And that's why we treat some of those people with medications that actually provide a dopamine level. So think of the brain disease as dopamine. If you get an addict and you give them the choice of not using drugs or dying, literally some of them will choose the second alternative, because living without that, having none of this normal positive reinforcement that we all have, is just too much for them to bear, and maybe understandably so. Addiction is a chronic disease, and what that means is it doesn't go away. It's like diabetes or hypertension. We manage it, but it's always there. One of the things AA members tell new members is that, if you're an addict, if you're an alcoholic, you've got three choices. You're going to either die, or you're going to end up institutionalized, either in a hospital or a prison, or you're going to recover. Those are the only three options. This is a chronic disease. It keeps progressing. It never goes away. And that's important to remember and understand. There are very few, if any, that I've run into over the years, examples of people who were, severely or even moderately addicted, who became able to normally partake in alcohol or some other substance. That's why abstinence is such a big part of recovery. The risk factors in addiction, and again, we're learning more and more about this all the time, but genetics is a big one. Again, it's very rare to find an addict who can't trace addiction back in their family. Mental illness, we know, has an impact on addiction. Early uses of drugs, that might change that dopamine process that we were talking about. The social environment they grow up in. And then another one that we don't talk about a lot, trauma. We run a residential facility for women. We have 12 women in long-term treatment at any given moment. And very few of our clients have not had some type of generally childhood trauma. This same addiction specialist who I've worked with talks about how early childhood trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, can actually, and traumatic events can actually start to change those dopamine receptors. And it makes that person later in their life much more vulnerable to the impact, the positive impact, the euphoric impact that drugs and alcohol can have on their brain. So we're starting to understand that more, and we're treating it. We're starting to treat trauma. How widespread is this? Many of you probably know this. Here's some stats on alcoholism, but it's estimated about 25% of adults binge drink. 7% would probably, of all adults, would probably be considered alcoholics, or they're now using the word or the acronym alcohol use disorder. And only about 8 to 10% of those actually receive treatment. Almost 3% of all youth could be diagnosed with alcohol use disorder. We believe at least 88,000, it's hard to measure this because there's lots of other issues going on, but at least 88,000 deaths per year directly attributable to alcoholism or alcohol use. 31% of all driving fatalities involve alcohol, and there's a huge cost to society. As far as addiction in general, not just alcohol, but all substances, it's estimated that about 24 million Americans suffer from addiction. That's roughly 10%. I've heard those numbers for 30 years, that roughly 10% of people, certainly in this country, maybe in the world, suffer from addiction. What that means is that almost all of us know people, and they could be family members, they could be friends, acquaintances, but addiction impacts everybody in our community and our society. And usually those impacts are not positive ones. What about the opioid epidemic? An interesting thing happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, and many of you have probably read up on this a little bit, but we came up with this new miracle pain treatment in the 1980s. Purdue Pharma introduced Oxycontin to the world, and they assured us that it was, if used to treat pain, it was not addictive. And they worked closely with the American Medical Society, and they got hospitals and the medical profession to start treating pain as, I believe it was the fifth vital sign. Fourth or fifth vital sign. That's when that whole thing about what's your pain level, 1 to 10, started to come around. Hospitals were evaluated, and funding was tied to their ability to discharge patients and have those patients say they had little, if any, pain. Pain treatment became a big deal with an opioid called Oxycontin. We started to find out pretty quickly that the addiction issue, people did become addicted to it. It started to spread mainly on the East Coast, especially in Appalachia. I have a younger brother who's a medical doctor and had a family practice in Appalachia, in the hills of North Carolina. And for years, his family medical practice, he said about 80% of his patients came in, had some type of prescription pain addiction going on. He then actually started working in the field full time and is now a specialist on how to treat pain without narcotics. But that's where that kind of started. At the same time that the country was getting introduced to Oxycontin, primarily on the East Coast, on the West Coast, we started to see a heroin called black tar heroin, which came up from Mexico. It was dramatically cheaper than the other heroin that was prevalent at the time, and it was delivered by generally Mexican drug cartels that came into the West Coast in an extremely efficient way. I mean, they started delivering it like they delivered pizza, and that started to take over. As as those two started to converge, they met each other. And what happened was we started to do a little better job controlling prescription drugs. And that moved people who were now addicted to opioids to this black tar heroin, which was easily available. Overdose deaths started to increase dramatically, and it became a major epidemic. It's now estimated, these numbers get a little awkward because this 140 Americans a day involves all unintentional poisonings, and there's a number that aren't, overdoses of heroin or Oxycontin or prescription drugs, but 140 a day is a huge number. And until the opioid epidemic, the #1 cause of death in the United States from unintentional means or natural causes, in other words, the #1 cause of accidental death, were car crashes, had been that for 50 years or more. And then about 10 years ago, because of the opioid epidemic, unintentional overdoses and poisoning surpassed that. It's now the leading cause of unintentional death. The economic impact has been phenomenal. We don't spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's just huge. The impact on society from medical costs and emergency rooms and law enforcement, on and on and on. That's one thing about addiction. We'll talk more about that next, but it doesn't just impact the addict. It has a significant and devastating impact on family, friends, employers, and the community. To treat addiction, we need to treat every part of it, including the family dynamics involved. And again, there's always those involved. This issue of shame and how as addiction progresses, it impacts everybody. It starts to foster, both in the addict and in their loved ones, kind of a distorted perception of what reality is, and it destroys healthy relationships. If you think, and I do a lot of comparison with other chronic diseases, but if you think about the devastating impact of things like cancer or hypertension, I mean, it's terrible. We lose loved ones all the time. I wish, we all wish we had a solution, we had a cure. We're working on those, but generally, other than the grief accompanied with the loss of a loved one, it doesn't have the impact on the family that addiction does. Addiction can exhaust the financial resources of other family members. It can cause bitter disputes and alienate family members from each other. It's way, way more than just the impact on the addict. We need to understand that and be aware of that. We just mentioned this, unhealthy forms of interaction between family members and friends, all of these things. You've all heard of codependency, denial, guilt, shame, projection. All of this stuff is a byproduct of addiction. One of the things, and that's part of the reason we like to do these presentations, that's important in treating addiction is we, as either loved ones, family members, or just as society, need to understand the disease concept. And hopefully I'm sure we'll have some questions on that. I'll be happy to answer more, but it becomes a lot easier to treat an addict if we're all treating it as a disease, as a brain disease, which it is. One of the things I saw once, which I thought was very impactful in a family session, is you get so angry, whether you should or you shouldn't, you get so angry with an addict or an alcoholic who continues to drink, continues to drug, continues to destroy themselves, their lives, maybe their family, their spouse and children. You get so angry with that, and you direct it towards the addict, and that does nothing to help the addict get back into treatment or into recovery. And so I saw an exercise once where you had the family member, you had the addict, and then they'd hold up a curtain in between them, and the curtain was the disease. And the concept was be angry at the disease, hate the disease, love the addict. Hate the disease, love the addict. And I thought that was a great way, a great tool to learn how to look at this. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit into recovery and what does that look like? And this is the good news. I'll talk more about it in a minute, but this is the good news about addiction. It's more than just abstaining. There's a lot more to recovery than just abstaining. It's a physical process. It's an emotional process. It involves repairing relationships. And in almost every case, folks, it's a spiritual process. Very, very few people come, hit their bottom, so to speak, or get to the point in their life where they're ready to seek treatment and have a strong spiritual position. They just don't. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual disease, and all three need to be addressed. We've all heard this old saying, people don't change. Fundamentally, people are always the same. Well, I got to tell you, you work in the addiction field and you see a lot of people that have made dramatic changes. They're very, very different than they were before. Addiction, I used to hear a guy say to addicts, I got a little upset. He said it so much. He was a counselor. He said, what do you get when you sober up a horse thief? You get a sober horse thief. And, he'd laugh, and I thought it sounded kind of stupid, but I started to understand later on what he was talking about. What he was talking about was that you can't just take the alcohol and drugs away from the alcoholic and addict. If you do, nothing changes in their life, and eventually they're going to need to cope with life. They're going to need to go back to alcohol and drugs. So recovery is about more than just, abstaining. Recovery is about achieving a kind of life where the addict alcoholic does not need to drink or drug again, does not need to use drugs, alcohol to change the way they feel, which is what they've done virtually their entire lives. So, now the result of that, and this is pretty positive, is when that happens, I believe this is about the only disease where the patient, the person with the disease, can actually be better off, more whole, more fulfilled, better human being than they were before they got the disease. And generally that involves a dramatic improvement in their spiritual condition, the way they interact with others. You've probably all heard of the 12 steps of AA, which are now part of, all these other anonymous groups, but they're about basically about a better relationship with God and how to, clear away the wreckage of the past and repair relationships. So, when you meet people who are in recovery, and my guess is many of you had, not only are these people not killing themselves with alcohol and drugs anymore, but if they're working a good program of recovery, they've got a life that was way better than the one they had before they probably picked up that first drink. And that's, this is a terrible disease and how it destroys everybody around them. But it's a tremendous recovery in the fact that, again, the addict becomes better than they were before they actually got into the depths of their addiction. Attagon Addictions Recovery, or many of you have heard of it. I think I saw a few names on here. People might even been involved with the founding of OAR 50 years ago. We are a nonprofit. We're here in Holland. Our mission is to facilitate recovery, enhance the well-being of people with addictions and co-occurring mental conditions. We provide treatment, education, support for those affected with conditions. And again, we hope that it restores lives and makes our community healthier. Started in 50 years ago with the Chester Race Center, which and I'm not as familiar with all the history as I should be, although since this is our 50th year, we're all learning more about what happened 50 years ago. But there were some members of the community who kind of opened what became a kind of a sober living facility for men. It later transitioned into a treatment program. They later added outpatient. They later added a women's residential facility. And today, we provide outpatient therapy, both individual and group, intensive outpatient treatment, which is kind of like residential, except you go home and sleep in your own bed at night, and residential treatment. And our residential program is one of the only ones in West Michigan that is what's referred to as long-term treatment, and that will take virtually anybody regardless of their ability to pay. And that's not part of our mission, but everybody here is kind of proud of that. We work with people who have no other options because they've lost everything, probably due to their addiction, at least all of their financial resources. We get reimbursed through Medicaid. We get a little bit of private insurance, although not residential, it's just an outpatient, but we get reimbursed through Medicaid. As a business, that's been a challenge because Medicaid rates have been depressed for a long, long time. I think we're finally starting to make a little progress on that. But the people I have the opportunity and the job I'm in to get to know a lot of our clients and to work with them a little bit. And these people are really in a spot in their lives where they desperately need help and have very few options. And OR is just one of those options. Now, unfortunately, because we're one of the few options, we have a long waiting list to get into residential treatment. And, unfortunately, waiting lists for addiction treatment aren't very good, because when a person's ready, they're ready, and they may not be ready a week from now or a month from now. And quite frankly, they may not even be alive a week or a month from now. So we wish we could get to the position financially where we could actually open more beds, because the demand is certainly there. There's no firm evidence, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the pandemic has increased, it will increase the need for addiction treatment, both outpatient and residential. It's hard for us to measure that because, again, we always have a waiting list in residential. Outpatient has been impacted a little bit by COVID because of the difficulties of meeting people face to face, but we've actually moved into telehealth, and we're doing quite a bit of that now, and we're seeing a lot of clients. We're pretty much back to normal. But anyway, that OR has been providing these services for some time. We continue to provide these services. Everybody who works here is passionate about this work and what we do for them. A couple of things we've done that are a little bit different. We've employed recovery coaches for a long time. Recovery coaches are people who are in recovery, who work with people brand new in recovery and help them navigate through difficult issues like a safe place to live, unemployment, finding employment, in some cases, legal issues. And recovery coaches, there's been a lot of research, they have a big impact on that person's ability to stay clean and sober and lead a productive life. Several years ago, we started working with families of addicts and alcoholics, and some of this presentation actually talked about that, but we mentioned how this is a family disease, and the more a family understands it, the better support they can be for that act, and quite frankly, the better their lives can be. So we've got a family program where we invite members of the family to either come in for individual or group counseling. This year is going to be a big year for OR. As I mentioned, in December, we'll celebrate 50 years in existence. That's for a nonprofit, that's pretty special. And we're going to use this opportunity, this 50 years, to kind of make sure the community knows what resources we have to offer, and also to give the community an opportunity to help support us. We've been so budget strapped because of our revenue sources, being so frugal, that some of our buildings, I'm going to talk about them in a minute, have been challenged from a capital standpoint. And we just found out that a major West Michigan donor has agreed to provide a dollar for dollar matching commitment to help us raise the money we need to get our buildings back in condition and prepare them for the future. And then lastly, and this is actually the first time we've mentioned it publicly, but we will introduce, as part of our 50th year, a new identity. Ottagon started because of a geographic location. We're kind of in Ottawa and Allegan County, sit right on the line. We're treating people from all over West Michigan now. We probably, most of our residential clients come from Kent County, mainly because that's where most of the population is. But that geographic description has not been beneficial, and people have not understood what that means and who OR is. So we will celebrate 50 years and launch it with a new name and a new identity, which I'm not going to share with you now, but we'll probably make that announcement in June of this year. These are our facilities. Harbor House on the upper left is our residential treatment for women. We have 12 women in Harbor House. So that's our capacity there. It doesn't have quite the waiting list that the Chester Ray Men's Facility does, because there is another program in Grand Rapids. It's called Our Hope, which also provides long-term residential treatment for Medicaid clients. So there is at least one other option in West Michigan for women. But the Chester Ray Facility for men, there's very few. Pine Rest, about 10 years ago, started offering addiction treatment, long-term residential for Medicaid clients. Unfortunately, because of this challenge of Medicaid reimbursement, they chose to discontinue that program on July 1st of this past year. So we're about the only game in town for that. As I said, we've got extensive waiting lists. If we can get our revenue reimbursements where they should be, and we're getting very close to that, then we'll probably be in a position where we can consider opening more beds, probably to start with for men, because that's where the demand is. Our main office is over here on Century Lane, and we own that building. Actually, we own all these buildings except for the Grand Haven facility. At our main office, we have all our administrative services and our outpatient clinic. So we have an outpatient clinic in Holland and one in Grand Haven. We lease that facility in Grand Haven. So those are our physical facilities. We're getting close to the end here where I can answer some questions for you. I do want to say that, you know, if any of you know anyone, and as I think I mentioned earlier, we're getting a lot of evidence that the need for help with addictions may be increasing as a result of the pandemic. But if any of you know anyone, please call us to schedule an assessment. You know, what happens is the client will come in, they'll meet with a counselor, a trained addiction counselor, master's level clinician, and we walk them through a very scientific process to provide a diagnosis on addiction. And we do a lot of that, and we'll recommend a treatment plan with them, and hopefully we'll get them on the right road. So that's the formal part of my presentation. I apologize, I haven't been looking at chats to see if we've got any questions, but I'd like to open it up for questions at this point.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
Do you get funding from Kent County?
Yes, we do. We receive funding from Ottawa, Allegan, Kent, Muskegon, and some from a couple counties north of Muskegon. The funding comes through community mental health departments. So we work with the Ottawa County Community Mental Health Department. They're the ones that are kind of the gatekeepers for Medicaid funding for mental health and substance abuse. And Network 180 is the name of the Community Mental Health Department in Grand Rapids, and we get funding from them. Yes, we do.
Can you give me some sense about what your waiting list is like in terms of numbers?
Yeah, for men, it's probably 30 people on the waiting list. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the problem with that is we generally know maybe a week or two in advance when we're going to have an open bed. Now, sometimes somebody decides to leave before they should, or maybe we ask them to leave because of behavior or something like that. So those beds come up a little more quickly, but usually we have a little bit of notice. You know, we'll start at the top of that waiting list. We may make 10 calls before we can find somebody who still is ready to come into treatment. And you really wonder, what about the other 9 people, you know, who aren't ready? Did something happen to them? Are they're back out on the street? I would say about 1/4 of the people that come to us come from a homeless situation. So even just finding them and contacting them is hard on the waiting list. Just managing those waiting lists is a huge job. But if I could just give you an example, until this past year, we were reimbursed $114 a day for residential treatment. Now that includes room, board, and master's level counseling. I think the food and lodging component was $27 a day. And that rate had not changed in over 15 years, not even a cost of living increase. Our break-even rate was about $160 a day. And that's with, you know, salaries that are probably lower than they should be, administrative functions that are probably smaller than they should be. So, you know, we're now at the point where starting with Kent County, then with Ottawa, we're getting that rate closer to the 150, 160 number. So I think once we get to that point, then I think we can talk about potentially opening more beds.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm getting, go ahead.
Can you comment on the efficacy of the methadone treatments? I think that's kind of been discredited, but a little history on what they thought methadone could do.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. So methadone is part of something called medication-assisted treatment. And remember we talked about how these dopamine receptors have been severely damaged in opioid addicts. What that means is the withdrawal they go through when they stop, for many of them, is unbearable. It's worse than death. You know, they'd rather stay on their drug and potentially die than go through that withdrawal. And so methadone was an attempt to prevent opioid withdrawal as they got people into treatment without having an impact on, you know, euphoria and getting them high and all that kind of stuff. It works. The efficacy is pretty good. However, it's difficult to manage. It's kind of a volatile drug. People, I think, had to take it in a liquid form. They had to come into a methadone clinic once a week. Drug dealers would hang around outside the methadone clinic and give them free samples of heroin, trying to get them back. I mean, it just, the whole process was not good. So in the probably 15, 20 years ago, a new drug was introduced for the treatment of opioid use disorder called Suboxone. And I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but it's a much easier to administer. It's in a pill form. And Suboxone is a combination of an opioid and then naloxone. Naloxone is the drug that they give people when they overdose from heroin. It immediately counteracts the impact of the drug. So the naloxone prevents any kind of high or euphoric feeling, but it prevents the addict from going into opioid withdrawal. And that has been extremely effective in keeping opioid addicts alive. You know, measuring outcomes in this business is extremely difficult because relapse is kind of a part of the process, unfortunately, and it's hard to track down addicts after they've been gone for a while, and you can't drug test everybody, so you got to ask them, and they don't always tell you the truth. You know, that's kind of one of the symptoms of addiction is dishonesty. But one of the things we can measure is whether opioid addicts overdose and die or not. And actually, these Suboxone results have been so strong that a lot of the federal money tied to the opioid epidemic has been directed towards medication-assisted treatment, generally Suboxone as opposed to methadone, because it seems to be so much easier to administer and work so well. And actually, OR will probably become a Suboxone prescriber in the next 6 months. That's one of the strategic initiatives that our board decided to implement in this year. So there was a little bit of controversy when it was first introduced because, you know, technically these people are still taking a small dose of an opioid, but again, there's no euphoric feel to it. There's all kinds of anecdotal information of clients that'll just tell you it saved their life, and more doctors are prescribing it. It's pretty exciting. I remember I talked to our clinical director before I took this job and asked what her thoughts were on it. And, you know, we talked a little bit about the controversy, and she said, the one thing I know for sure is I'm a lot more able to treat people when they're alive. And they've actually, one of the things we don't know for sure is, can an addict ever get off of the Suboxone? Can they? And there are examples, there's lots of anecdotal examples of clients getting off of it. But they've done several trials, research projects on this, and they've had to suspend them because the group that was getting off the Suboxone were overdosing and dying. So it's a challenge because of the huge withdrawal issues with opioid addiction, and it's all back to that whole thing on these dopamine receptors. And can they ever get back to normal? And can they ever get to a state of repair that the addict can live successfully, enjoy life, you know, without introducing these drugs that actually stimulate the dopamine release? Long answer, good question though.
Thank you, David. I have quite a few that have come into the chat now. The first one is, what % of the patients that you see deal with alcohol problems versus opioid problems?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we call it primary drug of choice. There are very few people that come in here and only drink alcohol. Very few people, if any, that come in here and only use opioids. I would say roughly right now, primary drug of choice, we're about a third. Alcohol, opioids, and methamphetamine. Unfortunately, methamphetamine has made a little bit of a resurgence, and I'm not sure any of us know why, if it's easier to make now or what the case is, but there, virtually every one of those who would identify that as their primary drug of choice uses the other two. And so, yeah, it's roughly a third, a third, a third.
Okay. Next one is, in your opinion, have the federal initiatives to address the opioid crisis over the past few years been effective?
Yes, I think so. I don't really have a strong opinion on that. Most of the funds that I'm aware of have been administered towards this medication-assisted treatment. You know, quite frankly, we can get funding from federal, you know, through Medicaid and Medicare for residential treatment. We can't get any funding from private insurance for residential treatment anymore. So I would say, you know, the federal response has been better than the private response has been in that regard. So yeah, we got a lot more to do. I think we're making some progress, although there's worry that progress may have been set back with the pandemic. But it's still a huge issue.
Okay, next is, what is your percentage of success? And
Great
maybe how do you measure that would be my question.
Yeah, I addressed that a little earlier. And, you know, one of my previous careers, I was a research consultant for the auto industry. So I've got some background in that. And, you know, one of the things I've always struggled with clients is, you know, we still have things in this world that we haven't figured out how to measure. And I hate to say that about addiction treatment, but there's some truth to that. And here's just a few of the examples. A couple of them I touched on. It's hard to even agree what the measure of success would be. Would it be keeping people alive? You know, that's one of the things we look at in the opioid epidemic, preventing overdose deaths. Is it restoring a person to, you know, a good work life, a good relationship with their family? Is it abstinence? You know, a lot of times abstinence is what we've measured. So first we got to decide on what those criteria are. Then we got to figure out a way to measure them. And, you know, we get, especially with our clientele, you know, we get a lot of people that come to us homeless and they leave and they may not even have phones. And so the ability for us to track them down 6 months later and find out how they're doing is extremely difficult. And then when we do, the only thing we can do is say, you know, are you clean and sober? And unfortunately, as I said earlier, it's a self-report measure that's probably not very accurate. The other issue that we have is, and let me just give you an example. Shortly after I started here, I've only been here about 1.5 years, but shortly after I started, probably about 1 year ago, we had a former client apply for a job with us. And she had been a resident at our Harbor House Women's Treatment Center, and really delightful person. We didn't end up hiring her because she didn't have the right qualifications, but we did go through a couple of interviews. And, you know, it was I think it was the first interview, she shared with me that she had been in Harbor House, I think 3 years before, but she had been clean and sober for 2 years. And so I said to her, what happened? And she said, well, she had a relapse, but then she got back into, you know, the West Michigan AA and NA community, and she's heavily involved, goes to several meetings a week, has a sponsor, loves recovery, would love nothing more than to work with OR. And I said, well, what role did your treatment at Harbor House have in your eventual sobriety? And she said, well, it's critical. If that was just one of the elements, but if I hadn't had that element, there's no way, you know, it would have taken the second time. What she learned about herself in treatment, I mean, so were we successful or weren't we? You know, she didn't stay clean and sober after she left us, but she's clean and sober today. So it's a very difficult thing to measure. We measure client satisfaction. We ask clients when they come in and when they leave how their treatment was. We have those results. We do our best to measure outcomes, but it's a challenge. Now, I will say, we've got a large alumni group. We've got people that, you know, have been through treatment, you know, over the last 50 years, still in West Michigan, who sing the praises of the treatment they received at OR. We have a tremendous amount of anecdotal evidence. There's not a shred of doubt in any of our minds that what we're doing is effective. But to actually give a final number is a little difficult.
Okay. Does your organization work with National Alliance on Mental Illness in terms of providing family support?
I do not think we do. I can't say much more about that. I come from the business background, not the clinical background. That's an organization I have not heard of. If whoever asked that question knows something that I should be aware of, I ask them to reach out and let me know.
Okay. Let's see. I have quite a few here, so hold on. We have one asking for you to talk about the people you asked to leave. How many, when, why, how often does that have to happen?
All the people we asked to leave. I would say about 80% of the people that come into residential treatment leave successfully. And that's usually between 60 and 90 days after they arrive. A percentage decide on their own. We're not a lockdown facility. We've got a few people that come to us because the judge said if they don't, they could be in worse trouble. So we got a few of those, but people can leave at any time. So we have a percentage of those that do. I would guess the percentage of those that we ask to leave is less than 10%. And it's usually because of drug use. They go out on a pass and they come back and we do a drug test and they test positive. On a few occasions, we've had some people smuggle drugs into the house, but it's rare. It doesn't happen very often.
Good. These two you might be able to connect. The first one is, what is your relationship with AA in our community? And the second is whether or not you're connected with other similar programs outside of West Michigan region. As an example, connections with the Grand Traverse, Northwestern Michigan area.
Yeah. So Aaa was founded with a focus on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we continue to promote those. We do get clients that have a real aversion to the spiritual nature of the 12 steps. Mm-hmm. And we will provide them with resources to other groups, such as Smart Recovery, which has been growing rather rapidly in the country over the last few years. I'm personally a huge proponent of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and the 12 steps for several reasons. I think the spiritual solution has been proven by far to be the best form of relationship with these folks. Secondly, everybody agrees that an addict or alcoholic needs to get involved in a recovering community. They basically need to change their friends. They got to get new friends, the friends that are in recovery. And there's way more options with NA and AA than there are with Smart Recovery and some of these other programs. So, one of the things people new in recovery are told to do is go to 90 AA or NA meetings in 90 days. So they, and what that does is it gets them used to going to meetings. They find a bunch of different meetings and they find a bunch of new friends, healthy friends. So we're big proponents of that and continue to be. As far as Northwest Michigan, we don't work with any of those counties up there. There's a similar program up there that works with Medicaid clients like we do called Bear River. And I actually visited with them a couple months ago, met their CEO, and we kind of compare best practices and some of that type of thing.
Great. Interesting question. Do you know if there's an impact of concussions, like from sports, et cetera, on substance abuse severity or treatment difficulties?
Good question. And the answer is I do not know that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
I think this whole trauma issue, anything that impacts the brain's natural production of dopamine, mm-hmm. We believe can have an impact on eventual addiction.
Mm-hmm. Question, are genetics also behind why some people strongly resist getting addicted to anything? I would assume yes, if you don't have the genetics.
Yeah, probably. I think that's a good, yeah.
What proportion of your new clients have already lost their family ties, marriages, et cetera, because of addiction? And did they wait until they were out of those relationships to seek mending?
Yeah. Unfortunately, with the client base we deal with, probably 90%. It's extremely sad. Now, everybody that comes into recovery isn't in that position. Just because of our ability to accept people that don't have funds, we tend to work with people who have lost all their funds by the time they get to us. And if they've lost all their funding, they've probably lost a lot of other things like relationships. Very few of our people have not had some type of run-in legally. whether it's a drunk driving or something else. So yeah, we work with a group of people that have been through significant hardships.
How effective in general, and I would guess part of the question would also be, do you often run into individuals with who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder that makes treatment difficult?
Yeah, we do. So a lot of our clients have and I always say this wrong, but co-occurring mental conditions of some kind. In fact, I would guess 80–90% would have some other mental illness diagnosis, whether it be bipolar, even schizophrenia, depression, as I mentioned, trauma. So it's a big number. Our folks are well trained on that. They know how to work with that population, but it's a challenge. It really is. The problem is, determining which condition is kind of the underlying. Can you treat bipolar if somebody's got an addiction and that's left untreated? Can you treat the addiction if they're not being treated effectively for bipolar? So, our staff is good at that, and we have a lot of it.
Okay. Question about how your organization compares to or relates to the program Building Men for Life.
Yeah, good question. We work really closely with Building Men for Life. I think the world of that organization, but they are in what's called, I might have this a little bit, but they operate sober living facilities. So after somebody leaves our treatment, many of the men go to live at Building Men for Life. It's not therapy. It's not treatment. It's not accredited by an organization like CARF, which we are, but they have very significant rules on what it takes to live there, and they pay a portion of their rent and so forth. So we've talked about offering sober living facilities as part of our service. If any of you are so inclined to get involved in this issue, there is a significant need in West Michigan, in the Holland area, for sober living facilities for women. Building Men for Life I think they've got 18 of them now. They've done a great job doing it for men, but there's only a couple of options for women. We have women come into Harbor House, and we start working with them on day one, and we're still working with them 90 days later, trying to find a safe place for them to go live after they leave our program. It's a big challenge.
Interesting. Okay, another question about the book Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic, whether or not you've read that and whether or not you'd recommend it as a good resource for education concerning the opiate problems. There it is.
Yeah. I got 6 of them on my bookshelf. I give them out freely. I think it's an amazing story. It's not a story, it's nonfiction about the opioid crisis and how we got to where we're at. I would strongly recommend it if anybody has an interest in this. And there's some stuff, I think this book touches on it. It's something my brother has worked on extensively. I mean, this whole opioid crisis was driven by a lot of things that are just really hard to reconcile. For example, the treatment of chronic pain. I guess we probably have some doctors in the group, but my understanding is there's 2 kinds of pain: chronic and acute. Acute is when you're injured in an accident or surgery or something like that. Chronic is like back. It's just always there. There's a tremendous amount of evidence out there now that a combination of Advil and Tylenol, ibuprofen and acetaminophen, do a better job treating chronic pain than opioids do. Yet for years we went out and we anyone that had any kind of knee pain or chronic pain of any kind, we told you said, here's your Oxycontin, and we turned them on to addicts. So there's a lot of we got into this situation kind of a dishonest way, and this book really starts to paint that story, how that all happened. I strongly recommend it.
Okay. A person is asking if you can say anything or reflect on the relationship between addiction and violence.
I can't. I wouldn't feel qualified to say that. Unfortunately, addiction leads to crime. Now, how much of that is violent? And mostly it has to do with trying to keep your substance coming, whether it's stealing or dealing or driving drunk or whatever. We work with the West Michigan Recovery Court, Ottawa County Recovery Court. We work with a lot of their clients. These are people who've gotten in trouble with the law and who the judge believes that the primary reason they got sideways with the law was because of their addiction. And that if we treat the addiction, the likelihood of reoffending goes way down. And there's a lot of evidence to support that's the case. And so, yeah, we've worked with those folks and continue to work with those folks. How it actually relates to violence, I'm not sure I can say.
Okay. Couple kind of fun comments here. One is that shouldn't the people who owned Purdue Pharmaceuticals fund you guys for everything on your wish list and at least $160 a day for everyone on your waiting list?
Yeah, they should.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that story, but.
Yeah, there was a, I need to look into it. It's relatively recent, but I think in the last 2 or 3 months, there was a big settlement with them. And I think a lot of that was directed towards organizations like ours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And then scrolling through here. Obviously, several compliments thanking you for masterfully clarifying addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing, and acknowledging how frustrating dealing with these folks can be in the real world. I think if I've missed anything, anybody, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask or make your comment. I'll scroll through one more time here.
Hey, I see Coach Boltman there. Hey, Coach Boltman. Coach Boltman was my football coach my freshman year in 1973.
Oh, yeah, you probably know a lot of people on this call.
Yeah, I know.
I just wish we'd had more like you.
Okay, I think I have everything. So if anybody else would like to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so. It is 10:38. We understand if you need to go and sign off when we thank you for being here, but we'll stay on for just a couple more minutes.
Kim, who is the author of Dreamland?
Sam Quinones, Quinones. Quinones, Sam Quinones.
Thank you.
I just want to talk a little bit about the genetic component. Actually, my mother's father was an alcoholic. My father was an alcoholic. My brother died of alcoholism. My son is a binge alcoholic. I married into another family, closet alcoholics. And so my kids have such genetic loading. It's just incredible. And my daughter, unfortunately, married into another alcoholic family where the dad and brother are alcoholics. So the genetic loading sometimes is just incredible, and depending upon life circumstances, it's just really hard to deal with it. So families, Al-Anon and AA are just wonderful supports. And I really recommend Al-Anon for anybody that has anybody with an alcohol addiction. It just is a huge support for you and the family. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Unfortunately, it's not like a lot of other diseases that have a huge genetic component, but there is probably something a little different about addiction, and that addiction by definition creates dysfunction in families. And, whether that is people, who are codependent and keep marrying addicts, there's a lot of those examples, or people who become addicts. There's not only this gene, but there's also the learned behavior that comes out of it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. And, what's really nice is if you get people into recovery, they can then break that cycle for future generations. And we see that happen too.
And I think the interesting part of it is we have people with master's degrees. Almost all the people have gone to college and graduated. So it's not an economic problem. It's more of a genetic or social problem, but it doesn't mean that you have to be poor to be alcoholic. It can be in a very well-connected socially conscious family. So it's a big issue.
Yep.
So, anyone else?
I'll just say I'm impressed. It's a very good presentation, very much appreciated.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate that. This is actually the bio that was read said 2017. I started in Aaa in November 2019. So I've only been here about a year and a half. And I want to do more to spread the news about, addiction and how it can be treated and what we do. This is only the second presentation I've made, so I want to refine it a little bit more, but I appreciate that comment.
I'm curious, Dave, what compels you into this work? Is it personal experience or just professional life? Or?
Yeah, so I'm in recovery. I've been in recovery for almost 32 years. So I in 1989, I entered a treatment program in Grand Rapids, and I've been heavily involved in the recovering community. I was on the board of a nonprofit treatment program in Grand Rapids. I kind of helped them merge with Pine Rest. I was on Pine Rest board as kind of an addictions specialist. I was on the OR board 2 years ago when the executive director position opened up, and then I got on the search committee, and after a couple meetings, they asked me if I'd consider doing it. So that's how I can't think of anything better at this stage in my life to be hopefully helping people receive the same kind of benefits from recovery that I've been given. It dramatically changed my life in an extremely positive way. And I just know how good it can be for folks. So I'm blessed and honored to be able to do this kind of at this stage of my career.
I'd like to congratulate you, the board, for having the forward-looking perspective here on what can be for OR. I remember I was with United Way years ago, and I remember our having a meeting, and that was one of the things that I felt at the time was OR is not just here. It seems as though it is far more reaching than just the Holland area.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you all are looking in that direction.
Good.
And
Thank you.
rebranding.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great presentation.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay,
Great.
everybody.
Great to hear you, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks, Coach.
Thanks for being here, Jim. Joyce, do you want to say goodbye to David and everyone?
Certainly. We're grateful that you shared your expertise, David. Thank you.
It was awesome.
Thanks, everybody. God bless.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, Kim.
David, I've stopped recording. I just have a quick question for you. I'm curious about. Is he still there? Maybe he's gone. Shoot. Okay, he's gone. I'll ask him later.
What were you going to ask?
Oh, I was just curious, I mean, like for finding a place for women to live once they get out of treatment, like if people's personal homes, if they've been through some sort of vetting process would be an option, like to take a single woman into your home if you have an extra bedroom and are willing to do that, kind of like foster care, but for, something else. Or if the importance of living in a group situation with more supervision is necessary. I don't know, but I was just curious.
Yeah, good question.
I guess since I'm nearing being an empty nester here soon. But you can get in touch with him later about that. A couple people did ask for his personal contact info, so I'll make sure that we share his email address. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kim.